Hello, it's Joseph, and welcome to the final episode of this Colonizing Kerbin series. And in this episode, we will be founding the final colony of the series, and that, of course, is on the beautiful moon of Laythe in the Jool system. So here is our colony ship performing a Laythe gravity assist in order to capture at Jool. And now that the colony ship is captured, it only has to perform a couple more maneuvers for it to finally be at Laythe permanently. In addition to the colony ship, the sample return probes have also arrived. So this is the sample return Mark II. It's just completed its pass of Tylo in order to capture at Jool. And here is the sample return Mark I. The sample return Mark I will land on Jool. It will gather up the science samples that the colonists have gathered on Laythe, rendezvous with the sample return in orbit, the Mark II in orbit, I should say, and then the Mark II will return to Kerbin. So it is going to complete its Tylo gravity assist, and we are quite close to the surface, though we are on the dark side and you can't quite see it, so mostly silhouettes there. So we just performed a second Laythe gravity assist to bring down I got ahead of myself. The colony ship is going to perform an additional Laythe gravity assist in order to drop its apoapsis down to be more relative to the moon, and then eventually it will perform its capture maneuver. So we will be going back and forth a bit from the probes and the colony ships. The probes are running low on fuel. It takes about 500 to 600 meters per second of delta V, depending on the relative velocity of the craft, to capture at Laythe. And so, since both of these probes are pretty much down to around 1,000 to 1,200 meters per second of delta V, there's not much room for error. So some gravity assists are going to be necessary, and it's going to take several days. I believe this craft is going to take about 120 days to get to its apoapsis. So it's going to be a while before these things arrive at Laythe, but that'll give the colonists plenty of time to establish their base and to, actually perform some scientific experiments and do a little exploration on that moon. That moon, which is a bit of a mystery, because we're very far away from the sun, and for some reason this moon has water and a breathable atmosphere and ideal temperature conditions. So the colony ship is about to capture here at Laythe, and just like with the Duna colony ship, we have to slowly ramp up the throttle and slowly ramp it down so that the rings don't shake themselves apart. And now we're on probably what has become my favorite part of this entire series, and that is disassembling the colony ship and then reassembling it into the ring habitat station in orbit. And this is a lot of fun to do. So these are the docking arms, the docking module. It has 3 arms so that 3 craft can dock with the station. And you will notice that these modules all have senior docking ports. So the idea is that in the future I can expand this space station with more docking ports, more fuel tanks like this fuel tank here that is undocking, or maybe whatever other ideas come to mind for future expansion. So this might be a good time to mention what I have planned for the future of this save file. And I don't plan to give up on this save file. I do want to come back and explore Duna, Laythe, the Mun, Minmus, and all these places more. But I am a full-time teacher in real life, and you may have noticed that the episodes have not been coming out as frequently. And that, of course, because the school year has started, and it is pretty difficult for me to find time to not only, play the game, but also record it, edit it, do the commentary. So my thought is I will kind of do what I originally did when I started this series, which was to just record footage over, the course of several weeks, several months. And then once I've compiled enough footage, then I can start, editing it into short episodes to air. So if there's going to be a season 2, that's probably how I'll do it. So You'll probably have to wait a while to see more frequent episodes, but every now and then I may pump out an episode here or there just to kind of show what's going on with this series. But for now, the main goal of the series was to colonize the Mun, Minmus, Duna, and Laythe, and in addition to that, set up ring stations above Kerbin, above the Mun, above Laythe and Duna, and also establish satellite networks, and then basically just set up a transportation network so that Kerbins can travel to and from all of these destinations. So one thought I had in mind was maybe we could do a grand tour at some point. A Kerbin could travel to all of these destinations and kind of show all of the, how everything works and such. Well, anyway, enough of me talking about what I may or may not plan to do in the future. You'll just have to come back to the channel to see what's happening. So now that the ring station is all set up and the 2 probe-controlled SSTOs are docked, this Laythe SSTO Mark II is going to rendezvous with the station. This should be the primary SSTO of the expedition. I mostly plan for it to remain on the surface of Laythe so that the colonists can travel to other islands and explore, and the probe-controlled SSTOs will still be useful and allow Kerbins to travel to and from the ring station. Before we can take Kerbins down, though, Laul, our head engineer of this expedition, is going to get out and run an inspection of the ring station to make sure everything is working properly, and she noticed that some of the robotic arms did not fully deploy because someone didn't properly set up the action group before they left for Laythe. But thankfully, Laul is happy to get out there and fix the issue and make sure the base is fully deployed in preparation for them to land Kerbins on the surface. So now we just got to move the Kerbins around a little bit and get them prepared. And in addition to that, we're going to transfer some fuel from the SSTO Mark II into those 2 probe-controlled SSTOs. So those probe-controlled SSTOs are able to get into low Kerbin orbit, but that also means they're very low on fuel, so we transferred some fuel from the Mark II into those. But also we got rid of some of the oxidizer. This craft isn't going to need very much oxidizer to land because it just needs the oxidizer while it is in space. And once it touches down, it will just need liquid fuel. And here is our Mark II making its final approach towards the base. And in a second, we're going to deploy the landing legs. The approach looks good. Brakes are out. And touchdown. Very nicely done, Valentina. You definitely deserve that retirement. You've done a lot of good for this space program. So Valentina is going to get out here in a second, and she's going to plant the flag. She is the founding Kerbin of this expedition. She is the lead Kerbin for this expedition, and she will be the first mayor of Laythe. So congratulations, Valentina and Bob and Laul and Tefel and all of the other Kerbins that have traveled here. We have 22 Kerbins on this expedition. We're going to leave about 8 Kerbins in orbit. 3 of them are going to be the crew for the Jool transport, which is waiting in orbit right now to rendezvous with the station eventually. So that leaves about 14 Kerbins full-time on the surface. So these 2 engineers are going to get out and join Valentina in setting up the base. But while that is happening, Bob and Laul have decided that they would like to get into the science truck as soon as possible and start exploring, because after all, they are explorers. They want to explore this beautiful island that they are going to call their home, so might as well get out there and start looking around. Before we do that, the wheels sustained some damage when it was deployed from the station in the last episode, so we have plenty of repair kits. It takes 2 repair kits to repair each of these wheels, so Laul's going to get out and repair those tires. And you notice me moving some science, or Bob was gathering some science there. Well, that's because the Rover actually conducted some science experiments while it was in Jool's atmosphere for a short time when the base was performing a aero capture. So now they're out there on this beautiful joyride. They discovered an interesting stone, so they decided to deploy the robotic arm to gather some samples to take back to their laboratory. And then Bob's going to jump out and he's going to take some core samples, and he's going to have those core samples go into the sample return probe when it eventually arrives. And apparently we're really close to another biome. So the base landed in the shores biome, and then after Laul and Bob just drive away just a little bit, they discovered that we were right next to another biome. And so that's going to be good. That's going to maximize our science, which isn't really important to do because the whole tech tree is unlocked, and this is essentially a sandbox save at this point. But I'm also trying to see how much science points I can get by the end of the series. So now that has been completed, we discovered this beautiful geyser, which you're able to gather scientific data from using the robotic arm. However, you cannot have a Kerbin take samples from it. But anyway, figured this would be a nice scenic place to set up the experiment station that they brought along with them on the truck. So here's Laul setting up the communication dish and 2 RTGs. Because we brought along science lab modules, we were able to upgrade the Kerbals, and Laul is now at a level 4 out of 5, so she only needs to set up 2 RTGs. So now that everything is set up, Laul and Bob are going to go off and head back towards the base, but before they head back, they decided to take in the sights, and it was at this moment that Bob felt the passion come over him, and he realized that he really wanted to make a grand gesture. So he turned to Laul and said, "Laul, do I have your permission to marry your brother Richland?" You see, Bob and Richland have been dating for a while, and Richland is one of the pilots, and Laul, who coincidentally is married to Teffel, which is Bob's sister, turned to Bob and said, "Dude, just ask him yourself." And Bob's like, "You know what? I will do that." So as soon as Bob got back to the base, he ran into Richland's arms and he declared to him, "Richland, will you marry me on this beautiful moon of Laythe?" To which Richland said, "Oh yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I love you and everything, but we're on another moon. Let's make history and get married." So Valentina was able to perform the ceremony because, being the mayor, I guess that makes you qualified to marry other Kerbins. So she will perform the ceremony after a short whatever you call that stage between marriage and proposal. Wow. As you can tell, I planned this commentary very well. And we're kind of glossing over a kind of important moment here. So this is just showing off that the base can refuel all these SSTOs. Anyway, so congratulations to Bob and Richland and to all the colonists once again. All right, so this is our first probe-controlled SSTO to come down to the surface of Kerbin. And later on, you'll notice that when this craft goes into orbit, yeah, you see that? Yeah, I definitely did some damage there, and I didn't notice it right away. But later on, you're going to see this thing trying to get in orbit, and it's going to be very shaky. It's going to be flipping around all over the place. And I'm not really sure what damage was done to the craft, but what I had to do was basically just go back to a previous quick save. So I had to do this twice, unfortunately. You may have noticed that the probe-controlled SSTO was backing up there, and those wheels are not designed to go in reverse. So what I have to do is I have to select the wheels, set the, I think it's traction control. You can go back and pause to be certain what I did, but you set it to manual instead of auto. And basically, when you do that, it will start, the wheels will have less control or less connection to the ground, and then the craft will start rolling backwards. So it's kind of a handy way to put the craft into reverse without actually telling it to go in reverse, which Kind of wish that the creators of KSP had just kind of done that, but you know, hey, you know, it's kind of cool to find workarounds of these little quirks sometimes. And here comes our second probe-controlled SSTO. Not quite as graceful either landing, but it did fine. However, it did take out a solar panel, so one of our engineers had to get out and repair that. It takes 3 repair kits to repair that large solar panel, and whoever was controlling that probe-controlled craft was given a stern talking to by Valentina. Resources are limited, after all, and it will be a while till the next resupply probe arrives, so we can't be just going around busting things up. And here we are, refueling this probe-controlled SSTO using our robotic arm to do so. So these 2 probe-controlled SSTOs are going to return to orbit. One of them will stay up at the station so that the crew in orbit have a means to get down to the surface. And then the other one, once it brings down the final 4 colonists, here it is flipping out, by the way, the one that I had to redo the whole thing on. Anyway, sorry. The crew that will stay in orbit will have a means to get down to the surface, and then once that final 4 colonists go down to the surface of Laythe, they will keep that probe-controlled SSTO down there just in case they need it. The idea, practically, is that the Kerbins that are on the space station will cycle with Kerbins that are down on the surface, so that way they can get some real gravity every now and then, so they're not, you know, going into atrophy. Obviously, the ring station is designed to help with that, but it can't, you know, it can't fully simulate the gravity that the Kerbins need in order to maintain their health long term. So that's the plan overall. Alright, so here is the second probe-controlled SSTO docking with the station, and now that that is complete, our final 4 Kerbins can now return down to the surface of Laythe, and that's all of the colonists down on the surface. So it was really nice to see these SSTOs do their job after so long. After a long time having them travel out there and all the other projects and craft and everything. Oop, we overshot a little bit there, but we were able to turn around and get the SSTO into the proper position. So the Kerbals have to exit through a hatch at the top there of that crew module, and then they just go down the ladder. All right, anyway, this is what I was waiting for. So the science truck can also serve as a cargo transfer vehicle, not just a science vehicle. And so Laul and Bob use that to bring some additional science experiments that are on the base, that are in the storage modules on the base. So that way a bunch of Kerbins, or 6 Kerbins, sorry, can load up onto the Mark II SSTO, and they're going to go out and perform an additional expedition while they're waiting for the sample return probes to arrive. And speaking of sample return probes, our sample return Mark I is ready to perform its next maneuver burn, which should put it on its final rendezvous with Laythe. And now that it has done that, it can perform its capture burn. It will not be able to fully capture at Laythe, so we'll probably have to do some aero brakes to bring down its apoapsis and eventually rendezvous. Alright, so the Mark II is off. Now to get this thing off the ground, it can use the Panther engines only to get the craft off the ground. However, it's a little safer to also fire up the rapiers and get additional speed, because if it's going just a little, if it's going too slow, it can stall out. So for safety reasons, I use both the rapiers and the Panthers to get off the ground. Once it's flying over 120 meters per second, and I just switch off the rapiers and fly on Panther engines solely. So these Kerbins went over to an island close by to the main island, and they brought along a bunch of science experiments that are attached to the SSTO. And Bob's going to get out, he's going to plant a flag, and he's going to start setting up another experiment control station And Laul has joined him, and Laul's wife has joined him, Tefel, and Richland has also joined them, Bob's fiance. And of course, Valentina is also out here. Valentina, as the mayor, can choose to fly around Laythe all she wants, and that is her prerogative. So obviously, even though she has retired here on Laythe, she wants to fly around a jet, and a jet that is capable of getting into space as well. And who can blame her? I mean, if I were to retire on Laythe and I was the mayor, I would totally do that. So now that all the Kerbins are over here, they decided, hey, let's all get out. Let's breathe the fresh air. Let's maybe swim and relax on the beach and sunbathe. And oh yeah, let's perform some scientific experiments and let's take a picture. All right, picture taken. Well done, everyone. All right, so the Kerbals are going to jump back in, of course, and we're going to demonstrate some more capabilities of this craft. The craft can land in the ocean, and it is also capable of getting off the ocean. In order to do so, it has to put the Panther engines into wet mode and also use the Rapier engines. And once you get to the craft's maximum speed on water, you then have to switch the Rapiers into their closed cycle. However, I didn't bring any oxidizers, so I'll spare you the footage, but I actually had to take the craft all the way over back to the island. Basically, it was a boat for a little while, and then I was able to get on land and launch it. And before we returned to the base, the Kerbins decided to make one more stop because we got a ridiculous amount of fuel. So they decided to head over to the peaks. Now, this peak was going to be one of the potential spots that I was going to land the base, and I actually decided to settle on the base's current location because there was more quote-unquote flat ground or level ground available where the base is, and since we're using plain style SSTOs to get the Kerbals around, it just seemed like a better thing to do. But of course, this SSTO just proved that this would have been just as viable of a space. And one of my thoughts is possibly in the future we might place a temporary base over there, or just a secondary base, maybe for mining, maybe for science, who knows, or maybe just a resort base. Yeah, you know, a mountain resort base on Laythe, looking at the scenery, and you know, maybe eventually there'll be tourists and they can take in the sights and take pictures of where the first colony is. Who knows? Sky's the limit, right? So anyway, here is the colony ship. It is making its final maneuver, which is to crash. And I decided to crash it down on our island so that it can trigger the seismometers and give us back some additional science points. And what a beautiful explosion. Thank you for your service, Colony Core Module, and thank you for the science points. All right, so our Jool transport has been waiting for some time here in orbit. Now it's performing an aerobraking maneuver because apparently the craft does not have a probe core on it. Well, what I mean by that is the Jool transport itself. The upper stage has a probe core, so since the upper stage is running low on fuel and we need the probe core from the upper stage, I decided just to perform an aero brake so to get it down to the station's level. And now that it has docked with the station, the upper stage is going to use its RCS thrusters, since it's out of fuel, to destroy itself on the surface of Laythe. And the Jool transport crew are ready to begin their portion of the mission, and they are going to do some flyby maneuvers of some of the moons of Jool. Before we can do that, we got to go back to the Sample Return Mark 1. It is performing another Tylo gravity assist. And it's important when you do those gravity assists that you take control of the craft, because sometimes if you let the gravity assist to happen when you're not controlling the craft, it can actually mess up your orbit lines. So this Jool transport crew's first destination is going to be Vall. The plan is to perform flybys of most of the moons of Jool and gather additional scientific data, you know, because eventually we may colonize all the moons of Jool. So it would be a good idea to get out there and start collecting data and getting a better idea of, you know, how these moons function. So after they performed science high above Vall, and low above Vall, after they leave Vall's sphere of influence, they're going to perform a maneuver and rendezvous with Tylo. And then after Tylo, the crew will head out to Pole. Now, of course, that leads Bop, and I'm going to go ahead and talk over this sample return alignment maneuver. You can just watch it and see what happens. So Bop, we decided to not go to Bop, and mainly that's because Bop is on a very different inclination from the rest of the moons. So in order to get to Bop, there technically is enough delta V to do so, but it would have required more gravity assists, and at this point I was just getting pretty tired of gravity assists. The sample returns have been doing gravity assists. Basically everything has been doing a gravity assist out here at Jool, and I was starting to get, you know, I was starting to feel the the exhaustion of doing all the gravity assists. So I decided, you know what? Let's just skip Bop. We can always go back to Bop later once this craft is refueled, and when we refueled, we can do a more direct course of action towards Bop. Well, we are coming up to Tylo here and performing our science high above Tylo, and eventually we'll perform science and low Tylo orbit. And then after that flyby, the crew will then perform a maneuver to rendezvous with Pole. So there's a nice shot of all the action that's going on there. You can see these sample return probes are still making their way towards apoapsis and eventually their maneuvers, though they are looking like they are pretty much about on their final trajectory towards Laythe, and then they can basically finally serve their purpose of returning science back to Kerbin. So there is the maneuver completed for the Jool transport, and it is on its way to Pole. Oh, something's happening at Duna, and that's right, we had a sample return Mark II also heading off to Duna, and it has finally arrived. And once it has performed its capture burn of Duna, Bob down on the surface, there he is going to take all the scientific samples and data that they've collected here at Duna that is, you know, quote unquote not transmittable, because technically it is transmittable in the game. He's going to put that on the sample return Mark I, which came down inside our cargo craft here at Duna, and it is going to rocket itself into orbit. Now, this craft is capable of not only getting into orbit of Duna, but also returning to the surface of Duna without refueling. This is mainly because Duna's atmosphere is so thin, and there's plenty of fuel, and that spark engine is surprisingly powerful when the craft doesn't have very much mass. Now, there's no RCS thrusters on these two craft, so they will have to kind of just point at each other and perform their maneuvers using the main engines. But, you know, at this point I've had a lot of practice with docking, so it wasn't really that difficult. You basically just get the docking ports lined up and then maneuver them into place. Now, the Esper stage here, you see me targeting that little piece that we jettisoned. I was trying to fly into it and was successful, and it will crash on the surface of Duna. So once these craft are docked, all we got to do is select the two sample containers and move the science from one over to the other. And the sample return Mark II, which you can see has a heat shield on it so that it can survive re-entry in Kerbin, will now deploy its solar panels, and it's going to have to wait, looks like almost 2 years. I think we're in year 10 right now, so it's going to wait a year and a half, 2 years, something like that, for its transfer window back to Kerbin. But the sample return 1 probe will return to Duna, so it can be reused. So, as you notice in the series, I like to have reusability, and it's really nice that this probe is going to be reused. All we have to do is have it hop on over to the base and attach itself to the arms, and it can be refueled. All right, back to the Jool system once again. And our sample return Mark II is making its capture burn of Laythe. It does not have enough delta V to circularize that orbit, but thankfully Laythe has an atmosphere, so we'll use the atmosphere to perform a few aero brakes. I didn't put all those on screen. This episode is going to be long enough as it is without me showing you every single detail that's happening here. All right, so our Jool transport crew has arrived at Pol, and Pol isn't much larger than Gilly, if I do remember that correctly. And essentially, a Kerbin could, I believe, use its RCS thrusters to get down to the surface of Pol, but I decided, hey, it doesn't take very much delta V to land on Pol, and we have all these additional science experiments, so let's go ahead and bring the whole ship down, and that way we can run these science experiments on the surface. And then, once we've done that, we can have our Kerbins get out and walk around, explore, plant a flag, take some surface samples, hit a golf ball, you know, all the things that you do when you go on a moon. And for all future astronauts in real life, make sure you do all those things when you go to the moon and eventually to Mars and all those things. All right, so the crew are done with their expedition of Pol, and so they're going to head on back to the craft. They also decided to have a little bit of fun with the craft, and they decided to use just the RCS thrusters to lift off from the surface of Pol. They jokingly thought that maybe they could get into orbit, but obviously that was not going to be the case. Not enough monopropellant. But again, we are using nuclear engines, so that means, or a nuclear engine, so it doesn't take very much delta V to get this craft off of the surface of Pol. And now the crew is circularizing on Pol, and we can start setting our maneuver to return to Laythe. Now, since we're starting to run out of delta V, we are going to use Tylo a gravity assist from Tylo to lower our orbit down closer to Laythe's orbital line. Sorry. The trick is to try and get your relative velocity as close to the celestial body's velocity as possible to minimize the amount of delta V you need in order to capture. And so by using Tylo, we can basically do that. And as you can see, this orbital line is very horseshoe shaped, which means that we should be using pretty much the bare minimum amount of delta V to capture here at Laythe. All right, so finally, the sample return Mark I is entering the atmosphere of Laythe, and it's going to land pretty close to the base. However, the center of mass was not centered where I thought it was, so it took about 9 tries to get this right, because when I originally set this up, I figured the heat shield would just, do its job and keep pointing towards the atmosphere, and that would help me, get it to land correctly, but it didn't. I've already lowered the amount of ablator on the heat shield because the heat shields are very overpowered in this game. Anyways, we landed it safely within walking distance of the base. I was very proud of myself to have pulled off that landing, considering how difficult it was to control the craft. So Bob is going to take all the scientific data they've gathered from the shores biome, the island, the geyser, the peaks, and he's going to place it inside this sample return craft. You'll notice the sample return craft has a docking port on the top of it. In hindsight, I probably should have put a nose cone there so that it could be a little more aerodynamic when it gets into orbit. But hindsight's 20/20, I guess. The Jool transport crew is stopping by the sample return Mark II to take their scientific experiments from the moons of Jool and place it in the sample container. And several orbits later, it was able to rendezvous with the space station. All right, so the sample return Mark 1 is now lifting off and heading for orbit. And as you can see, it's gonna, there it is, flip because of its aerodynamic profile. But thankfully that didn't happen until the first stage was done with its fuel. And so now we are rocketing into space. And surprisingly, this little spark engine, once you get into the higher atmosphere, was able to really get the probe into orbit. But as you can see, unlike at Duna, this sample return Mark 1 will not be reusable. So after it has docked with the sample return Mark 2 and transferred over the science, we are going to use this upper stage to bring the sample return 1 and of course the upper stage itself down into the atmosphere of Laythe so that they can destroy themselves. I didn't really try to aim for an island, but I did get a little lucky. I wasn't trying to aim for an island because we were on the dark side and I couldn't really see where it was going, but somehow I ended up getting this upper stage to land on an island somewhere on Laythe, and we were able to get some additional science from it because of the seismometers. Alrighty, so we're about to come to the end of the final episode. Wow, so basically all that's going to happen at this point is our 2 sample return Mark IIs from Laythe and Duna are going to return to Kerbin. They're going to re-enter the atmosphere, and we're going to gather up their science points. So I think this would be a great point to say a few things to wrap up the series. I want to say thank you to everyone that's watched this series. There haven't been very many of you, but that's totally okay. This has been a really fun experience to complete this project, to set a goal of colonizing the Mon, Minmus, Laythe, Duna, setting up the research station in orbit of Kerbin, the ring station, all of the satellite networks. I mean, it was just really a lot of fun to do all of this, and even though it was only a few of you watching, I really appreciate all of you watching, and I've thoroughly enjoyed doing all this. And so I mean, just thank you all for tuning in, and hopefully I'll be able to make some more episodes in the future, but I got an important job to do, educating students, and so I'm looking forward to putting more of my attention there and ensuring that my kids get the best education they can in the classroom. All right, so the sample return you see landing here is the one from Laythe, and you're gonna see a little explosion, but that's just the probe module or the heat shield exploding and the probe control module. So we had to, but once we got it back, we got a lot of science from that probe and from the Duna probe, and we are over 40,000 science points. So that's where we're going to end this series. When we're going to end this series with some lovely beauty shots of the Laythe ring station and the Rave base. So at this point, I'm going to let you guys enjoy the footage, and I'm going to sign off at this point. This has been Joseph, and this has been Colonizing Kerbin. Thank you so much for watching.